During World War I, there was a great migration north by Southern African Americans. The war had caused a labor shortage in northern industry. Citizens of foreign countries were returning to their native lands. From every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north.
I grew up the son of migrants. We were on our way, my mother and father were on their way north when I was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So at the very beginning of my understanding of communication with words, I was very much aware of this movement which took place starting right after World War I and continuing on through the late 30s.
So I think it's appropriate to begin with the South when one talks about anything having to do with African American culture. Yet it's interesting. Here we have Jake Lawrence, born in the North and growing up on the streets of Harlem. And at the same time, he has enough history built into him already to reflect on those beginnings of his parents, parents, of other people who make this incredible journey.
And I think what we have in Jacob Lawrence is that second generation of migrants who are beginning to look at the experiences of their parents and their relatives and saying, wait a minute, something important has happened here. Wait a minute, something that we need to capture is happening here. And his thought, I think his genius, is to recognize the importance of these events and to put them on canvas so we have them for the long term.
I had never seen a boll weevil. I had never seen cotton. To this day, I don't think I've seen cotton. So I had to improvise. I had to improvise a bug or what I thought a boll weevil was. Maybe I looked it up. And to me, it was I liked the design. I liked the design element. So I was far removed from the culture I knew. But yet I was very close to it through my mother and through her friends. So there's a paradox here, being close and yet far away, because my culture, although it's not Southern, although it's Northern, urban Northern, is Southern, because my background, my family's background, the friends of my family were all Southern in culture, food, everything else. In 1930, we arrived in New York's Harlem community. I was 13 years of age. It was a very vital, very energetic, very alive community. And like most young people, you work with color, you're giving crayons, you're giving poster paint. And I just started putting down colors. And I remember my mother, like all families at that time, used to decorate her homes and her home in all sorts of colors and patterns. And in thinking back, I think that was to, in a way, alleviate the Depression period, which was pretty drab, could have been more so had we not had these other elements to help us.
Jacob Lawrence was born in 1917, so that by the time he became a teen, he was in the midst of a community that really encouraged and supported people, not just in terms of kind of moral support, but there were infrastructures within Harlem, the community arts centers, the libraries, the YMCAs. All of these institutions had people in them who encouraged young people to do arts and crafts, to express themselves in words and music and dance. And he was just very, very lucky to have grown up at that point when there were all of these people and organizations in place within Harlem.
I can never give the community enough credit for the encouragement that it gave me. The teachers who purchased some of my works, the librarians, for very, very little. You think in terms of almost giving it away. But that $5 or $10 that they would pay for a small work meant more than the $5 or $10. It was the idea of you doing something of worth that somebody else wanted.
I think the environment in Harlem that allows Jacob Lawrence to begin to grow and to blossom is an environment in which you have a lot of different cultures and ideas and people coming together, and an ability on the part of these various people to begin to respect the different ideas, to encourage growth and development, to encourage experimentation. And I think what you have happening for Jacob Lawrence as he comes to Harlem is he moves into a very nurturing environment, a place where people see his uniquenesses, his strengths, his potential, and are willing to nurture that and move it forward. And I think that's a wonderful moment in time for him and for that community, in that they are open to new forms of expression.
I was about 13 or 14 when I came in contact with Charles Alston, a mentor.
Charles Alston was one of those players at the various art centers in Harlem, and he encouraged Jake to continue and pursue his art, and it was a wonderful balance of providing some basic kinds of information and sharing of materials, but at the same time not imposing an aesthetic on this young man.
You know, when you're 13 or 14, you don't have the authority, you don't have the experience, and you don't know the know-how to reject certain kinds of philosophies, irregardless of how valid that philosophy is. You said, well, I must be doing it wrong. Everybody's saying you do it this way and not that way. So that was a very, very important period.
We've talked about Charles Alston as being a really important person for him. There were other artists like Walter Christmas and Romy Bearden and even his future wife, Gwendolyn Knight, who he met in Harlem in the context of these kind of collectives. When I think about groups like 306, this collective that Jacob Lawrence was a part of that was comprised of all of these very interesting African-American artists, I think about other collectives. We've seen examples of this in other places. The School of Paris in the 1920s had its cafes where people sat down and discussed things. And I think 306 is very similar in the sense that it was a gathering of like-minded individuals who had in common a community and a desire in the 1930s to address the artistic and thematic possibilities of working in Harlem.
It's probably fair to say that the migration has a real impact upon the cultures that existed in the North. That also has Southern roots because many of the people, African Americans already living in the North, had come from the South generations earlier. So they carried some of that culture with them. But it had changed over time. So when the newcomers come with the Great Migration, you do have a new amalgam being created. And out of this amalgam comes new cultural forms and new cultural ideas. Jazz is a good example of that. That's a coming together of those two cultures. So I think, yes, it's fair to say the migration does change the cultural roots of African Americans in the North, as well as I think how the North itself entirely sees itself and reflects itself. The Harlem Renaissance is a good example of that because you have all new writings and new perspectives and art appearing that not only impacts the African American community, but impacts the entire Northern community, the entire American community, so that you have real changes taking place.
In 1940, Jacob Lawrence received a $1,500 Rosenwald Fellowship. It allowed him to rent his first studio for $8 a month in a loft building at 33 West 125th Street. The prestigious grant was one of 400 Rosenwald Fellowships awarded to African Americans between 1928 and 1948.
I can't help but think that not only did it give him the space to make a larger, more perhaps profound statement in terms of the number of panels in his series approach, but being situated in Harlem gave him, in some ways, a front row seat for doing work that would reflect the stories and lives of all of the people passing before him, while he's sitting in his studio.
I would see kids coming up from the South black kids who were 2 and 3 years behind their school age in school. Well, that was reality to me. I didn't see Okies walking the streets of Harlem and coming up like that. I couldn't make that kind of relationship. Or Dust Bowl and things of that sort. And their situation was just as poignant. And just as John Steinbeck became very involved in this humanitarian or human trauma. And I was just as involved in the same thing, but from my own experience out there.
He is what we refer to as a community historian, that he is beginning to recognize the important stories in our community's history and trying to find a form through which he can give it back to the public in a way that they'll understand it and appreciate it. So that all the series that he's done have taken important historical moments and tried to capture them so that people can understand them and relate to them in a very direct fashion.
I wanted to create a work that was very sparse, you see it immediately, the dark, the light values, very high in contrast. The warmth of the red could be a bus, it could be a train, and it's a long, arduous ride from where these people came. I try to create a staccato-like rhythm over and over and over again, the shapes as they move. And throughout the series, I try to repeat this.
I think what distinguishes the migration series from these other pursuits, both in photography and social scientific investigations, is the fact that it's art with a capital A. And I don't mean to say that photography is an art, but that a single photographic image that shows a family standing by a car it can be a moving experience. But to see Jacob Lawrence's entire series, to see the colors that he uses, those kind of jarring blues against reds, the textures that he paints onto the panels, to see the shapes that he creates of these people, bent over, or arms reaching out, or heads bowed, or heads even looking up. His visual economy that he employs in these works is a statement that is very different than a photographic truth.
As a historian, as a community historian, what he's tried to do is to talk and listen and to study the experiences that people had, and from that, then go back and capture those emotions, capture those stories, capture those thoughts through the medium that he uses. This is not something you can do with photographs, I think, in the same sort of way. Photographs capture a moment at that particular time, whereas he's trying to capture a mood and a history and a feeling as well as the image of a specific event.
In November 1941, Fortune magazine published a color portfolio of 26 panels of the Migration series with text. Edith Halpert's Downtown Gallery commemorated the event by exhibiting the series in its main gallery. The series remained on view at the Downtown Gallery from December 1941 to January 1942. The Museum of Modern Art and the Phillips Collection split purchased the series in 1942.
Edith Halpert was one of the top galleries in the country. I would say at the time, she was like Castelli is now. She had an idea that she wanted to explore and see what was going on, what the black artists were doing, what was happening. And she was a businesswoman, of course, and she was thinking about this would also add further to her own development or to her own contribution to the art community.
Here was this Harlem-based young man who produced this extraordinary series, finally being seen and being he's given attention in magazines and newspapers. It was really unprecedented. And no doubt, people in the community, both black and white, probably assumed that there was a change that was about to take place. The Migration series speaks to a lot of people. Obviously, it speaks to African Americans and their stories about migrating from the South to the North and the difficulties on both ends. But I also think the series is valuable in a larger sense. The whole idea of migrating, the whole idea of transitioning from one place to another place has implications and resonates with the experiences of many, many people. I think that's the power of the series, that it can speak to so many different people and at the same time hold a very special, particular message for Black Americans and their story.
Well, I think today we always face decisions about moving towards the unknown. And possibly what this tells us is not to fear the unknown, but to think rationally and carefully about those choices and to understand that movement, change can be positive as well as negative. And I think that comes through very clearly in the migration series, in that you begin to see that change can be good, but it takes very careful consideration. And it also can have a downside to it that you have to watch spin out over time.
I don't think in terms of history in that series. I think in terms of contemporary life. And so I didn't, it was such a part of me, I didn't think of something outside, that I was doing a portrait of something. If it was a portrait, it was a portrait of myself, a portrait of my family, a portrait of my peers. That's what it was a portrait of. So in that way, it was like a still life with bread, a still life with flowers. It was like a landscape, you see. So I didn't think in terms of editorializing or anything of that sort. It was such a part of me. It's such a subjective statement, such a subjective feeling I had about this content.